Yes, good. For some reason, mine is all over the place. There we are. Okay. Well, I've been working as a volunteer for Make Votes Matter for about 6 months or so now, because the pressure for proportional representation is building up, I think, around the country, but particularly in the Labour Party at the moment. It's always, of course, been a central plank of Liberal Democrats policy. The Conservatives are rather more cautious about it for reasons that I will explain in a minute. But this is basically a presentation that I've been doing mainly to Labour Party groups over the last few months. Apologies for people who already know a lot about proportional representation, if some of this is a bit familiar, but I'll go through it as quickly as I can. First of all then, in 2016, 38% of the electorate voted Leave, 35% voted Remain, 14% didn't vote. So we left the EU with long-term irreversible damage, and that's first past the post. In 2019, 44% of the electorate voted Conservative or Brexit, 46% of the electorate voted Labour, Liberal or Green. The Conservatives won 65% of the seats, and the only check we have on the government now is by internal rebellion in the Conservative Party. The opposition can make noises, it can protest, it can criticise, it can comment, but it can't change policy in any way. The only people who can change policy are Conservative rebels in Parliament. That is first past the post electoral systems in practice. There are, crudely, two kinds of election. First past the post systems, the winner has complete power once they've been elected to do what they like, and they're elected by simply getting the most votes. In proportional systems, parties have to negotiate compromises to get things done. There are realistically only two major developed countries that still use first past the post, the USA and the UK. And then there's a whole string of our former colonies, India, Pakistan, West Africa, and so on. But overwhelmingly, the developed world, almost all OECD countries use PR. And you can see, I think, in the history of the last few years in the USA and the UK, some of the weaknesses of first past the post in practice. So what's wrong? First of all, most people don't get what they vote for. No party has ever got even half the votes that have been cast. Most seats are safe, so campaigns only pay attention to marginal seats. You won't expect to find any serious political campaigning going on in most of the Norfolk constituencies, for instance, because in most of them, they are absolutely safe Conservative seats, apart, of course, from Norwich South, which is an absolutely safe Labour seat. Most votes are wasted on candidates who are already safe or who lose. In 2019, 70% of all the votes that were cast either for candidates who lost or were surplus votes that weren't needed. In Broadland, 16,000 Tory votes could have stayed at home and it would have made no difference at all to the result. There's an enormous amount of wastage. Most people's votes simply don't have any impact. Many people vote negatively to stop the parties they hate because the ones they would support don't stand a chance. And that, of course, is how you have tactical voting and the difficulties we had in 2019 of trying to negotiate deals, particularly between Labour and Liberal Democrats, in the hope that somehow, since we all wanted to keep the Tories out, we would be successful. And we weren't, of course. Most people don't believe the system is fair and honest. 1 in 3 of them don't vote at all. And that is a serious indictment of any democratic system. This merely demonstrates the problem. The orange line at the top shows the winning vote for the party that won in every election since 1945. As you see, in 1951, we almost got half the people voting for the winning party, almost. But actually, the Labour Party got more votes than the Conservatives, but lost the election on that occasion. Since then, we've never got anywhere near half the votes being cast for the winning party. And as you can see, since 1992, the winning party has never got more than 40% of the votes. The blue bars at the bottom show you the proportion of the electorate who actually voted for the winner. That's taking into account the people who didn't vote at all. So as you see, at its absolute trough, Tony Blair's third election in 2005, only 22% of voters of the electorate voted for the winning party. That's hardly representative, whatever you think about the individuals. If you look at Norfolk, these two pie charts show you the problem. On the left, you have the vote share, 60% roughly of people in Norfolk vote Conservative, about a quarter vote Labour, 10–12% vote Liberal. But the seat share is quite different. 90% of the seats go to the Conservatives in return for their 60% of the votes. 11% of the seats, just one, go to Labour in return for 26% of the votes. The Liberals and Greens get nothing. If we had a proportional system, the result, as you can see, would be very different. The Conservatives would still have the majority of seats. They'd get 5 seats, but Labour would have 2 instead of its present 1. The Liberals and the Greens would have 1 each. That would be a much fairer representation of what people actually vote for in Norfolk. On the first past the post, the right, the political right, usually wins. Over the last 10 elections, Labour and Conservatives have both averaged 38% of the vote. That is a very startling figure. I was a bit surprised when I found it myself. But in fact, that's how it's fallen out. But the Labour vote is concentrated in cities and industrial towns, whereas the Conservative vote is spread more evenly across the country. The parties to the left of the Conservatives are more divided, so their votes get divided. And the result is the Conservatives won 7 of the last 10 elections, despite getting exactly the same vote share overall as the Labour Party. And you can see from this chart why that works. This is 6 constituencies. In each of those constituencies, the Conservatives get 38% of the votes, but the Labour vote is concentrated in the two constituencies on the left, so the Labour Party wins those 2. In the other 4, the vote is divided between Labour and Liberal Democrats, so that the Conservatives win them all on their 38% of the vote. And that is a very consistent pattern across the country. The Conservatives are evenly spread, and the opposition to the Conservatives is often divided. There's an international comparison which is done by the Labour Campaign for Educational Reform, a useful research report looking at the contrast between proportional representation and first past the post countries across the whole world over 53 years. And what that shows really startlingly is in first past the post countries, we have right-wing governments for 75% of the time. In proportional representation countries, the opposite is the case. It's 74% of the time vote for left-wing governments. That is a very consistent and remarkable result. The UK is actually slightly more equitable than that, in the sense that left-wing parties have actually got rather more than 25%, but the pattern is very clear. The LCER report looked at a whole series of measures to see how countries with proportional representation are different from countries with first past the post. What they found from a whole raft of internationally recognized data sources, proportional representation countries have stronger welfare states and better public services. They have stronger environmental policies. They make policy making on a more long-term basis. They have fewer wars and conflicts. They have better gender balance in their parliaments. They have higher turnout in elections, and they have greater voter satisfaction. Even the people who disagree with the result of elections are happier with the result in proportional representation countries than in first past the post ones. And that is the report. The link is there, and I'm happy if Sarah could circulate and perhaps circulate the presentation to people afterwards. But the link is there. It's available free online. And there's a lot of interesting and useful material there. So moving on, the mechanics of proportional representation. The principles are very straightforward. The seats number 1 should match the number of votes cast. If you get 44% of the votes, you should get 44% of the seats, not, as happened in 2019, 56% of the seats. The Conservatives got 56% of the seats for 44% of the vote. If no party gets 50% of the vote under proportional representation, they have to work with other parties to form a government. And that, of course, tends to produce longer-term coalitions, more centrist policies, as in the language of some of the Labour Party these days. But that's how it works. There are two broad types of proportional representation, which are both proportional and retain constituency MPs. And that principle is that retaining a constituency MP is widely seen as an important principle in the UK. There are proportional systems which work simply on a party list. In Israel, for instance, you vote for a party, you don't vote for a candidate, and the party decides who gets the seats. So the party that gets 20% of the votes gets the first 20 people, the people at the top of its party list. And there is no link to a constituency. I think everybody in this country is in favour of retaining constituency MPs, and there are two systems which achieve that. There are lots of minor variations, but they're two broad types. The first is additional member system, and the second is single transferable vote. They're both very simple for the voters, though they're more complex to administer than the first past the post system. So additional member system works on the basis that a proportion of the seats is allocated to constituencies and the rest to parties, and every voter has 2 votes. So you vote for a constituency MP and you vote for a party, and the party produces a list. And after the constituency MPs are elected, you look at the total result and you take MPs from the party lists in order to restore the balance to reflect the way votes happened. And you can see that in operation in the Scottish Parliament, which has additional member system at the moment. The green columns is the constituency seats. The yellow one is the list, the regional seats. Everybody has 2 votes. And as you see, most people vote for a constituency MP from the SNP. However, when it comes to the regional seats, the list voting for a party, they don't vote for the SNP. They vote for Conservatives, Labour, or Green, or Lib Dems. As you can see, if it was only the constituency basis, then the SNP would have an overwhelming majority. But most people think it would be a good idea to actually have Conservative and Labour members as well as SNP ones, so their second vote goes to a different party. And the Greens, you can see, is the extreme case. Nobody would, or the Green vote is spread so thinly across Scotland that no constituency would ever get a Green MP on its own. However, there are a good 5% of voters in Scotland who support the Green Party in principle, and they give them their list seats and list votes. And the result is that the Green Party gets 5% of the seats. So additional members system evens out the effects of first past the post. The second system is single transferable vote. And I should say again, this is simple for the voters. It's very complicated for the returning officers, but that's what computers are for, and it's mathematically quite easy to manage. Each constituency has several seats, usually 3 or 5. And of course, we used something like single transferable vote in the European Parliament elections 2 years ago. The voters put the candidates in order of preference. There is then a quota, which is the number of votes needed to win a seat. The mathematical formula is there if you want to go into it, but it's fairly simple. The candidate who reaches the quota is elected, and the second preferences of their surplus votes are added to the other candidates. If there are still vacant seats, the lowest scoring candidate is removed, their second preferences are added to the others, and this repeats until all the seats are filled. The result is that pretty well everybody's vote has some impact on the final result, because the second preference votes and the third and fourth preference votes sometimes will also be added. At its extreme case, we saw this in the Labour Party National Executive Committee elections recently, where I think there were something like 40 candidates. It took 37 rounds of calculation before all the seats were filled. But as I say, That's not a difficult task for the computer, though it looks complicated on paper. Who uses what? Additional member system is the more proportional of the two, because you can get the proportions almost exactly right by juggling the party list members to add on to the constituency members. It's used in the Scottish Parliament, the Welsh Senate, the London Assembly. It's used in New Zealand and Germany. It's recommended by the Plant Commission, the Jenkins Commission, the Hansard Society, and the Institute of Public Policy Research, all of whom have done major studies on proportional representation in the last 20 years. Single transferable vote gives you a stronger constituency link, and that's used in Scottish local elections, in Northern Ireland local elections, the Labour Party NEC, in Ireland and in Malta, and in the Australian Senate. There are a number of objections that people regularly make to proportional representation. The first is that first past the post ensures clear results. People vote for a manifesto, the government then delivers. This is effectively a minority dictatorship, and you can see the effect of that in our present parliament. On the basis of a minority of the votes cast, the Conservative Party has such a large majority in parliament that they can effectively do whatever they like, and there is very little scope for any kind of check on that power. PR means coalitions and compromises behind closed doors. Certainly under proportional representation after an election, well, possibly before an election, parties will talk about what sort of deal they might do with each other in what circumstances, and then negotiate agreements about the things that they agree about and the things they disagree about, and what kind of terms they're prepared to agree. However, it's also true that under first past the post, the existing parties are already coalitions. I think all three major parties have wings and factions within them, which would, under proportional representation, probably evolve over time into separate parties. The Corbynites and the Blairites in the Labour Party, the Free Marketers and the One Nation Tories in the Conservatives, the Orange Bookers and somebody else in the Liberal Democrats. Though there are already those uncomfortable tensions within the governing parties in reality, and the negotiations also go on behind closed doors. People often say that proportional representation does away with the constituency link. That's simply not true. You do lose the constituency link in a pure party list proportional system, but nobody is seriously proposing that for the UK. The proportional representation allows extreme minority parties into power. It's true that small parties get into power in proportional representation systems in a way they don't in first past the post. But I think there's a democratic argument, which I think one would have to accept in principle. When UKIP was getting 4 million votes at its peak and no members of parliament, and you could elect a Conservative MP with 35,000 votes, this was clearly undemocratic and unrepresentative. And I think there is a good argument that allowing minority parties into some sort of part of the process gives them a chance to expose their arguments and actually probably reduces their impact. I think the effect of Nigel Farage on our system from outside has been much greater than it would have been if he'd actually been in Parliament. And of course, you can control that with minimum quotas. In many proportional systems, a party has to get more than, say, 2% or 5% of the total vote before they can have a seat. The final one is a tricky one. PR is politically impractical because no party that gets into power will vote to remove the system that put it there. And that, I think, is perhaps the explanation why Tony Blair went into the 1997 election promising proportional representation and then didn't deliver, because actually the majority was so much larger than he'd expected that nobody in the Labour Party thought they would ever be out of power again. And they really didn't want to change the system. By the time it became clear that they weren't going to be in power forever, it was too late to change the system. So what we want, the Good Systems Agreement is an agreement between a whole raft of political organisations, parties, lobbying groups and so on, about what we want from a good proportional representation system. And it has a set of principles. First of all, it should be proportional. The number of seats should match the votes. It should be representative. The MPs and governments should represent the views of all the voters. It should be equal. The value of individual votes should not be distorted by factors like geography or tactical voting. At the moment, if you're a Labour voter in most of Norfolk, you're wasting your time going out voting at all. Whereas if you're a Conservative voter, you can certainly get your MP elected. And the people whose votes actually count in our present system are only the people in the marginal constituencies, of which there are very few. Typically about 10% of the constituencies change hands in any one election. They should maintain local links. There should continue to be a link between the MP and the specific area. It is one of the real strengths of our democracy, I think, that there are MPs, you can write to them, you can talk to them, you may not convince them, but they're there and they do have a direct interest in what happens in their particular area. A good PR system would also be diverse. Parliaments should reflect the diversity of the population. At the moment, they tend to produce very much a single class of politician, though their opinions may differ. There should be a wide choice of parties, and voters should be able to express preferences for people rather than just parties. You may well support a party but disapprove of the particular candidate it's putting up. It should be accountable. MPs and governments should be accountable to the voters, and that means you shouldn't have overwhelming majorities which make all political debate irrelevant. There should be a balance between stability and flexibility. It should engender stable, flexible government with the ability to compromise. It should be sustainable and adaptable, able to respond and adapt to changing needs without frequent or fundamental change. And it should be simple. Systems and ballot papers should be easy for voters to understand and use. And both single transferable vote and additional member systems are easy from that point of view. In one of them, you get 2 votes for 2 different things. On the other one, you get a set of candidates and you put them in preference order. Can we do it? We already use it in lots of places, in Scotland, in Wales, in Northern Ireland, in London, Labour NEC, many trade unions, many political organisations. Other countries have switched in the past. 27 countries have changed to proportional representation in recent years. Most democracies already use it, 80% of OECD countries, and the polling is heavily in favour. The most recent poll of Labour Party members, for instance, showed 3/4 of all members in favour of change. And that is an ICM poll from 2017, which shows very clearly, I think, the general public, 60% in favour and only 11% against. Labour voters even more positively in favour, and even Conservative voters strongly in favour. The idea that is floating around at the moment about this and about how we get to it is the notion of a progressive alliance. At the moment, the electoral majority is always to the left of the Conservatives. It has been in every election since 1935, but most of that time the Conservatives have been in power. So the proportional representation is the best chance for Labour of getting into government, though probably not into absolute power. Proportional representation would give Liberals and the Greens a much stronger, but probably, at least to start with, minority representation. So the question is it feasible to create a progressive alliance based on a one-time only agreement to introduce proportional representation? From the Labour Party point of view, I think at the moment, the chances of the Labour Party getting into power on its own at the next general election are extremely slim. The party has never overcome the sort of deficit it has at the moment in a single election, whereas it's certainly possible that an alliance with the Liberals and the Greens could achieve that. And it's possible that we could do a deal for also, conceivably, with the Scottish National Party, which would get us a majority in Westminster in order with a shared manifesto simply on proportional representation. We can disagree about anything else, but an undertaking that if the alliance comes to power, then the first thing it does is introduce proportional representation. The tricky question in all of this is Scotland. My personal view would be that the SNP might be attracted by the idea of an alliance in order to get proportional representation linked to a guarantee that they would have the right of an independence referendum once proportional representation was introduced. I think once we had proportional representation at Westminster, then the arguments about Scottish independence might look rather different. So that's the notion. There are all sorts of reasons why a progressive alliance is difficult to do. It's particularly difficult, of course, to do long before a general election. But at some point, I think we will have to consider it. And one of the champions of the Progressive Alliance at the moment is Clive Lewis, of course, the MP for Norwich South, whose arguments I share, that this is probably the best way of changing the system. It's the best chance of the majority of people to the left of the Conservative Party actually being democratically represented in the future. So, things you can do, there's a whole raft of things here. You can sign the petition on the Make Votes Matter website. Make Votes Matter is the umbrella organisation. There are a lot of proportional representation organisations nationally and locally, but Make Votes Matter provides an umbrella for those. You can join it as a member. You can invite, if you're a member of another group or organisation, invite a speaker to go and speak. And that's, you get somebody like me, so perhaps somebody better than me, who knows. You can advocate in your own political party, or you can volunteer to help in campaigning activities. Those are all possible links, and the links are there. And I will actually, I won't do that. If Sarah likes to circulate the slides to everybody after the meeting, then you will have all those links. The Many Not the Few report is a Labour campaign report, but it is an independent piece of research done into the way proportional representation might work in the